Hello, this is Lynn Hilton Wilson, and I'm excited to introduce our next lecture in honor of the 200th anniversary of the first vision. Today we are talking about the 1829 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and it is with much joy to include all 12 of them. There were many who hefted the plates and lugged the plates and saw the plates under a cloth, but there were 12 who had them shown to them and were able to see the engravings and move them around. As a way of background, I want to look at the timeline for this. In early 1829, in March, Joseph received a revelation from Martin Harris from the Lord, where he was promised that he would have an opportunity to see the plates if he were faithful. Now that's section 5 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and then that promise is repeated again later on in section 17 after the translation is finished. But the blitzkrieg of the translation with Oliver and Joseph begins on April 7th of that year, when he arrived a day and a half before on Sunday night the 5th, and they get the work done on Monday to prepare the home and are able to begin that translating about 8 pages a day from morning till night on April 7th. And that goes along full speed until the persecution rises. And by June 1st, Oliver, Emma, and Joseph have to move to the Whitmer household. And we'll go into some more detail on that move. And the last month of translation is in the upstairs room of the Whitmer home, and some of the Whitmer sons also join Oliver as scribes in order to finish the translation. It appears that it was finished about June 25th, although we have other documents that say it took about a month, so we're not exactly sure on the finish date. But earlier in June, while they are there at the home, we have our first witness of the Book of Mormon, our first witness with Angel Moroni showing someone the plates, and that is the hostess, Mary Whitmer. And then once the translation is finished, we have a newspaper publishing of the Book of Mormon title page, and shortly thereafter, probably about June 28th, to the best estimates of historians, Angel Moroni shows the 3 witnesses the golden plates, the breastplate, the sword of Laban, and the Urim and Thummim. It appears to be on a Sunday at about noon. And a few days later, the Joseph and Emma and Oliver and several of the witnesses go up north to Palmyra, and that's where Joseph is able to show the 8 witnesses the golden plates. And after they leave, he returns them to Moroni. So that's what we hope to talk about today. Let's first look at this map where the Harmony is down in Pennsylvania, Fayette about 100 miles north, and then Palmyra just north of 24 miles northeast or west of Fayette. The persecution was growing at this time in Harmony, and as a result, as the antagonism increased, Oliver and David Whitmer are writing letters, and Joseph receives through the Urim and Thummim a revelation for David Whitmer to come and get them in this wagon. The interesting part about this is the Urim and Thummim was not used at this point for the translation. It was used initially, and yet when it was time to receive revelations, Joseph goes back to receive it. This artist interpretation, of course, has very little to do with the accurate picture, but it's interesting to see what different artists come up with in the description, as we've discussed in earlier lectures. David tells his parents and his family members about the offer and the suggestion to move the translation up there. And as we had talked a couple of weeks earlier, 1829 was a very, very wet spring. And because it was so late, the rains had lasted so long, the plowing and the planting had not yet been done by the 1st of June. And so the Peter Whitmer Sr. agreed to have them come if, quote, the planting would be done. So David needed to plow 20 acres and enrich the soil with plaster of Paris to help their wheat grow. His father said that he ought to pray first to learn if it was absolutely necessary to leave now. The family was desperate for his help. But the next morning when David woke up and he walked out to the fields, he saw these rows of dark furrows in the ground that had already been plowed the evening before. And he found the plow waiting for him on the 7th acre. So he still had several to go, but 6 acres had already been started. The family saw this as a miracle. And as he finished that job that day, he was able to sleep well, and the next morning get up early, planning on doing the plaster of Paris. But his sister and others said that they saw 3 men working faster than they had ever seen, already spreading the plaster of Paris. All the Whitmer family saw these 2 miracles as God's divine intervention, and David was sent on his way down to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And he brought up Joseph. Emma actually came back later. And as they came up to Father Whitmer's house, Oliver and Joseph were given an upstairs room in order to do the translation. Now, I looked at some documents of actually who would have been in the house at that time. The Whitmers had 8 children, several of whom had already married. There were grandchildren. And it appears that many of those married family members are still living in this home. We know of at least 5. And then when Emma arrives, we have a very full, busy, small log cabin, which I hope gives perspective to the stress and the challenges that would have occurred that month of June as the farming season is in full swing. And everyone wants to be part of the translation. In fact, 3 of the Whitmer brothers ask if they can be part of the scribal work, and they relieve Oliver at different times instead of doing their other work. And it's during this time of transition that the noise and the commotion and the different needs and not being able to have your own home is when we hear of the story when Emma and Joseph have that disagreement, and Joseph goes up to translate, and he is not able to receive any revelation, and he goes outside and prays for an hour, comes back in, apologizes to Emma before he can go back and translate. There's just something wonderful about this story that is so human. I hope that each of us can be a little more patient with ourselves and also a little more sensitive to the spirits, so that we can realize how easily it can be offended by our thoughts and our words and our actions. I'm so grateful that this story was included in the saints. It's in the history of the church. I even think Lucy includes it in her book. It reminds me a little bit about Peter denying the Savior 3 times in all 4 Gospels. I'm glad that we see this side of our prophets that are doing their best, and yet they fall short. Not only is that good to see them in this light, but it's good to see ourselves in this light. And I'm thrilled that the Spirit returned, that an hour of prayer and apology is able to restore the work, and he moves ahead full steam with a more humble and meek approach. It was not only hard on Emma and Joseph's relationship after coming from their relatively quiet environment of their own home in Harmony to this very, very full home and all the enormous responsibilities. If we have 14 people living in this house, the workload was already large for any female in the home who's having to cut the wood and draw the water and milk the cow and make the butter and cheese and meals. But when you have company and the stress, it's very understandable why Mary Whitmer found this frustrating, especially when Joseph and Oliver would go outside and skip rocks. We have an account by her family members that said she was so fed up that Mary Whitmer had said, if they have time to go outside and skip rocks because Oliver's hands are sore or Joseph's eyes are tired, they have time to chop my wood. And that is a very different story than what we had in the history of the church that suggested Mary Whitmer received a vision of Moroni and the plates because she had worked so hard. It's true she had worked so hard, but it's, I think, very significant that the reason why the angel comes is because Mary was ready to kick them out. She had made up her mind that the next morning she was going to ask them to leave. And that's when we get this wonderful story that she is actually the first witness with Angel Moroni. But it's not a normal witness. Angel Moroni does not come in his white robes with shining glory all around him. According to the account that we have by 3 different people, Mary has just left the barn where she's milked the cows. It's still pre-sunrise, just at early dawn, when she sees an older man coming toward her carrying a knapsack of some sort that was heavy. And initially she was frightened, but as he spoke to her gently, all fear left, and he introduced himself as Angel Moroni. He shows her the plates, and let me read the account that was written up by Royal Skousen. He spoke to her in a kind, friendly tone and began to explain to her the nature of the work which was going on in her house, and she was filled with inexpressible joy and satisfaction. Moroni appeared as a short, heavy-set, gray-haired man carrying a package, who met her and said, "My name is Moroni, and you have become pretty tired with all the extra work that you have to do. The Lord has given me permission to show you this record," and turning the golden leaves one by one. Now, these spellings and accounts are taken from the journals of earlier family members, and the painting was just made a few years ago after being up in that area and watching the early sunrise. And I have to tell you a little bit about the models that are used. It's a Ukrainian couple who lived near the temple, who also were asked if every traveler that came by from Russia to the Ukrainian temple would be allowed to stay in their home. And of course, they had very little money to share, as most Russians had spent their funds in order to get to the temple. And this devoted couple, with their threadbare sheets, kept opening to more and more people seeking their blessings of the house of the Lord. So the painting is a beautiful one, and the story is even more beautiful. And the account is very consistent with other times the angels come. Think of the time in scriptures when angels come, and it's usually not when the person is on the right road. Every time, I'll just give you some examples. Laman and Lemuel, Saul and Paul, even Balaam gets, the angel comes and he can't see him, but the talking donkey sees the angel. All these times when angels come, it's to reroute someone. It's because they're going in the wrong direction. Most times that angels come is to reorient someone. If the Spirit is just giving direction in our lives, it's often gentle nudges and encouragement. And that's exactly what we see here with Angel Moroni coming to Mary Whitmer. However, we have not used her as one of the printed, published witnesses, because in the 19th century, when the Book of Mormon was first published, a woman's voice was not allowed to be a legal witness. However, in the 20th century, the church has been eager to publish her message, and she now has a whole section in the Church History Museum in Salt Lake, as well as in many books, records of this account. And I'm thrilled to see her as the first witness of the resurrection. I want to mention one thing about the clothing that Moroni is wearing. It is consistent with another account that David Whitmer left about the transporting of Oliver and Joseph up from Harmony to Fayette, or else perhaps it was another time in the wagon when they're going. But David Whitmer reported that he had seen the same messenger on his way when he brought Joseph and Oliver in this wagon from Harmony, Pennsylvania. Then he appeared walking with a knapsack on his back. It was a hot summer's day, and he was wearing a large overcoat. He had straps across his breast, and his nephew said Uncle David asked him to ride with them, to which he replied, "No, I'm going over to Cumorah," and suddenly disappeared in the midst of the plain. So it's interesting that we have these two accounts with Angel Moroni dressed in other clothes and also with a sense of humor and witnessing in different ways to those who were part of the early translation process. It's during this time when they're in the Whitmer home that we also receive a lot of people recording what they saw and heard and interpreted from the time that the translation was going on. Of course, they are only seeing and explaining what they saw Joseph doing. They were not seeing the words that Joseph saw. But one of the statements came out is when Joseph came downstairs, his face was exceedingly white, as was Oliver's. When they finished the translation, Joseph received another revelation that included information on the witnesses. Joseph has already received a little bit of information on witnesses coming from Ether chapter 5, verse 2-4, and 2 Nephi, which was probably translated after Ether. I think the small plates were translated following the book of Moroni, where we would have then had words of Mormon and then the small plates added to the end. But in 2 Nephi chapter 11 and 2 Nephi chapter 27, there's references to these extra witnesses. And so when Joseph and Oliver are interested in learning more about this, we have this great revelation that says, "I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, which if you do with full purpose of heart, you shall have a view of the plates, and also of the breastplate, and the sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim. And after you have obtained faith, and have seen them with your eyes, you shall testify of them by the power of God." Now, a few verses later in the same section, it sounds as if the translation was finished. And also in Lucy's account, it sounds as if the translation was finished by the time the three witnesses received them. And so Martin Harris, Joseph Sr., and Lucy traveled the 24 miles from Palmyra down to Fayette in order for this exciting experience, and especially since Martin has asked if he can have one of these, be one of the witnesses. Lucy recorded in her first book, in her first memoirs written in 1844 and 45, that they arrived that evening and they spent the time reading the manuscript, probably of the small plates and possibly of those verses in 2 Nephi that specifically dealt with the possibility of other people seeing the plates with Angel Moroni's help. Lucy continues on, quote, "The next morning after breakfast in the Whitmer's parlor, we had a morning service, and by 11 or 12, they've come together again, and the three witnesses, Martin, Oliver, and David Whitmer, joined Joseph to go outside into one of their woods. They pray mightily, but nothing happens. As most of us already are familiar, Martin removes himself, afraid that he is the problem, and shortly thereafter, Angel Moroni comes and shows them the plates. In one account, it describes that there was a table that had the Urim and Thummim and the sword of Laban and the plates on it as well. There's a record from the history of the church that says that Joseph, Oliver, and David were engaged in prayer when presently we beheld a light above us and in the air of exceeding brightness, and behold, the angel stood before us. In his hands, he held the plates. He turned over the leaves one by one so that we could see them and discern the engravings thereon distinctly. As we know, shortly after this vision closed and this experience, I'm calling it a vision, although it's really an interesting experience because they have their eyes changed and yet they're able to touch and feel as well as be in a state of spiritual distinction. But shortly after that experience, Joseph walks through the wood to find Martin Harris, and the two of them pray, and Martin has humbled himself and exerted enough faith that the angel Moroni comes and repeats the experience for him and Joseph privately. And Martin recorded, in an ecstasy of joy. Actually, I believe this quote and this spelling might be in Lucy's book, but it's still from Martin's words. 'Tis enough, mine eyes have beheld, and jumping up and he shouted, Hosanna, and blessing God. Lucy continues to say that the three men came into the house about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So they've been outside now since 11 or 12, and now it's 3 or 4. So a possibility between 3 and 5 hours. And Joseph exclaimed to his waiting parents, Father, Mother, you have no idea how happy I am. The Lord has caused the plates to be shown to 3 more besides me. They have seen an angel who has testified to them, and they will have to bear witness to the truth what I have said. For now they know for themselves that I do not go about to deceive the people, and I feel as if I was relieved of a burden which was almost too heavy for me to bear, and it rejoices my soul that I am not any longer to be entirely alone in the world. Just take a minute and think about the excitement in that home that day. They're in the Whitmer home, but his parents are there, and he is overjoyed that he has been able to show these plates to these people, his dear friends, and yet it wasn't to his parents. His parents are rejoicing with him, though, and it's a time of great joy for everyone involved. And these 3 become lifelong witnesses. We all know that each of the 3 had times when they were frustrated with some of the policies and practices of the church, and each of the 3 had times when they had disassociated themselves somewhat from the church itself. And yet I believe that the reality that they never denied their testimonies and they testified with their last breaths of life is perhaps even more powerful, that their witnesses to the reality of the Book of Mormon were firm, even when their frustrations with human foibles and future revelations were not firm. But we know that Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery were rebaptized and joined the saints, or attempted to join the saints, and David Whitmer died in Missouri with a strong and fervent witness on his lips, as he said his last words were of the Book of Mormon. Now that experience was down in Fayette, but according to Lucy's account, Joseph and Oliver and many of the Whitmer family came up to Palmyra within a couple of days. I forgot to mention one other thing that happened that was sort of important. When Lucy and Joseph Sr. came down to Fayette for this experience, Hiram did not come because the next day Hiram's wife delivered their first child. June 28th, they delivered a baby. And shortly thereafter, by July 1st or July 2nd, we have this entourage of Whitmers coming into the same home because it's Hiram's log cabin that the family is now all living in. I don't know if the Whitmers stayed actually in that home or not, or if they were over, I hope they visited Martin Harris or other friends at the time, because we have a brand new baby and it's a very small little home. The Smiths have moved out of their frame home by this time and are back in the log home, which was Hiram's house. But the 8 witnesses are basically from these 2 families, and they are the male members of the Whitmers and the Smith household. And this is the time when Joseph Sr. and Hiram and Samuel are able to see the plates, as well as the Whitmer brothers. And it was probably on July 2nd for the best historical patchwork of time, but it may have been any time over that week, including the July 4th. In addition to the wonderful account that's written of their testimonies in the Book of Mormon from Christian and Jacob and John and Hiram Page, who was a Whitmer by marriage. He had married Catherine. We also have an additional witness outside of the Book of Mormon from John Whitmer's hand that says, I desire to testify to all who will come to the knowledge of this address that I have the most assuredly seen the plates from whence the Book of Mormon is translated, and that I have handled these plates. That was published in the Messenger and Advocate newspaper in March of 36. We also have a record from the Times and Seasons newspaper from Hiram Smith in 1839, where he said, I felt a determination to die rather than deny the things which my eyes had seen, which my hands had handled, and which I have borne testimony to wherever my lot has been cast. And that is not only true of Hiram, but all the other witnesses. And Lucy goes on to explain that night when they came in, they had some sort of a testimony meeting, and even their young child, age 14, Don Carlos, bore testimony of the future work of the building of the kingdom of God. And these 12 witnesses have been joined by millions others who have studied the book and received a witness of the Spirit that it is of God. And the testimony that they bear of its reality is accurate. Look forward to next week's continuing on as we begin the publication of the Book of Mormon. Thank you for joining us.